Hey everyone, I'm Scott Krevitt. Welcome to my video presentation. Today I will be discussing a hot button topic in education, culturally responsive teaching. I'll explain what this theory is, where it originated from, why it's such an important way of thinking about teaching as it pertains to race and culture, and I'll also provide some examples of how culturally responsive teaching, or CRT, has been received by students around the country, and how student achievement for people of color have improved substantially. Moving forward, I'll also explain why CRT hasn't caught on yet to mainstream traditional ways of teaching. Let me backtrack just a little bit by talking first about a close relative to culturally responsive teaching, which is culturally relevant teaching. I won't talk too much about this, but I think it's important to see where the origins came from. Culturally relevant teaching is a theory designed by education professor Gloria Ladson-Billings, and she says it's a theoretical model that not only addresses student achievement, but also helps students to accept and affirm their cultural identity while developing critical perspectives that challenge inequities that schools and other institutions perpetuate. Culturally relevant teaching is a way to empower students intellectually, socially, emotionally, and politically by using cultural reference to impart knowledge, skills, and attitudes. A few years later, in 2001, another education professor, Geneva Gay, built on Ladson-Billings' theory by developing a stronger focus on teaching practices and coined the term that I will focus on for this video, culturally responsive teaching. Now, culturally responsive teaching is an educator's ability to recognize students' cultural displays of learning and meaning making, and responding positively and constructively with teaching moves that use cultural knowledge as a scaffold to connect what the student knows to concepts and content in order to promote effective information processing. All the while, the educator understands the importance of being in a relationship and having a social emotional connection to the student in order to create a safe space for learning. When integrated into the classroom instruction, culturally responsive teaching can have important benefits, such as strengthening students' sense of identity, promoting equity and inclusivity in the classroom, engaging students in the course material, and supporting critical thinking. An important element of how culturally responsive teaching fits through an anti-bias lens, you have to look at the work done by Zaretta Hammond. She's a former English teacher who has done her own theories on CRT and how we as educators should understand the perspective of diverse students. Hammond says there are cultures around the world that fit into a spectrum of two categories, individualism and collectivism. Many European countries fit into the individualism category, which focuses on individual achievement, being self-reliant, being competitive, your individual status is important. The United States was founded predominantly on these white European values. You work hard, you're rewarded for your efforts. Collectivism focuses on interdependence and group success. Learning happens through group dialogue, having good relationships, singing songs, chants, collaborate with each other. Hammond says people of color, African Americans, Latinos, they see the world more through this collective lens. As a result, as more minority groups become part of the education system, the old European ways of teaching these diverse groups are leaving them behind. Their family dynamics aren't wired to learn this way, and with so many standardized tests out there like Common Core, the multicultural groups appear, based on the test scores, to not be as smart or as capable as their white counterparts, but CRT has the ability to change that narrative. What are some of the ways in which a culturally responsive teacher will be successful in the classroom? Well, Hammond discusses a variety of ways a teacher can see their students. You must be open-minded and not see your student through a biased lens. Be willing to adapt and change your teaching on the fly so you can respond in a positive way to culturally different students. Be a learner yourself. You as a teacher can learn about other cultures. That can make you a more understanding teacher. Here are some ways teachers can teach CRT through a collective lens. It's important to teach CRT through movement, repetition, storytelling, and music. This allows the brain to go through cognitive routines to basically fire itself up to learn. In many communities of color, despite new technologies like computers, these diverse cultures still pass on traditions through oral speech, poems, and songs. The actual teaching has to be in quick spurts. The brain only processes for about 15 to 20 minutes before it shuts down for 10 minutes. The brain also stores information for about 24 to 48 hours unless you practice what you've learned. It's kind of a use it or lose it thing. It's also important for CRT teachers to get the attention of their students by doing things like drumming, chanting, or clapping. Maybe a specific piece of music signals a certain activity is about to take place, and the students know it. Also, be provocative. Do things like show a video clip that would arouse emotions. This ignites the brain's disequilibrium, getting the students ready to learn. You can have friendly trash talk sessions among students about the material discussed in school, in math and science. Have the students play games in small groups. The group reinforcement allows students to challenge each other and creates opportunities for them to put their lesson plans into their long-term memory banks. It's important to have many cognitive routines. When the student learns the routines, they become automatic, which allows dependent learners to become independent learners, which is critical for the success of CRT. Now that we've discussed what culturally responsive teaching is and some of its methods, does this type of teaching help students of color achieve higher standards? I found several examples around the country that show how well CRT works if implemented correctly. The first study centered around an experiment involving several low-income schools in the Mid-Atlantic region. The students at these schools were 94% Black, and their test scores on statewide math assessments were in the bottom 20%. The study was conducted by 3 education and psychology professors who study CRT: Sean T. Coleman, Eric A. Hurley, and A. Wade Boykin. The experiment involved 124 third and fourth grade students who would participate in a 2-week-long math lesson on fractions. The students were split up into 3 groups: a communal group using CRT, an individualistic group using CRT, and a naturalistic group using the same teaching methods they always used. The group of teachers picked to teach the courses went through 3 2-hour professional development sessions for 2 weeks beforehand, learning CRT methods. In the first communal lesson, the teachers arranged students in their assigned groups, and they would work together throughout the unit. The individual students sat at individual desks. There was 10 minutes of direct instruction followed by 15 minutes of communal or individual work depending on the class. Then the teachers conducted a 5-minute review session and the students were tested on the material. This was repeated over the 2 weeks for each lesson. In the communal group, students sat in groups of 4 and shared materials during instruction. The teacher asked the students in the communal group to hold hands with their neighbors before each lesson while the teacher delivered the communal prompt. This oral prompt reminded students of their shared school and community ties and encouraged them to do their best and to help support each other's learning the material. The individual group sat at individual desks, given their own materials, and were not permitted to interact with other students. The teacher gave an individual prompt, which was designed to emphasize individual effort and encourage everyone to do their best. The naturalistic group was given no outside help or training and proceeded with the lesson plans the usual way. Their lesson lasted 55 minutes with a warm-up, teacher-guided practice, independent student practice, and assessment. They were tested the same way as the other 2 groups at the end. Observations showed in the individual group the students were doing a good job and were attentive, but in the communal group things really took off. It was observed that the communal group helped each other and supported each other. The communal teachers were happy how their students supported one another and didn't fuss or fight with each other. One teacher said their students were, quote, getting it. Another teacher expressed positive thoughts about using communal prompts once they saw it was working. The individual group teachers also expressed positive feedback, saying they enjoyed teaching fractions in a different way. After the 2 weeks, the results showed the communal group outperformed the individual and naturalistic group by wide margins. On the final overall test, the communal group scored 80.67%, the individual group scored 70.67%, and the naturalistic group scored 60.4%. In the subsections of the test, the communal group scored 4 points higher than the individual group in identifying fractions and 15 points higher than the naturalistic group. Adding fractions, the communal group scored 12 points higher than the individual, 15 points higher than the naturalistic group. In subtracting fractions, the communal group outperformed the other 2 groups by 9 points and 23 points, respectively. The first example shows the effect CRT has as a teaching approach. The study found Black students who learned in a communal classroom experienced positive relationships between communal socialization and performance outcomes. It provides an example of what communalism can do as a pedagogical tool and what it can look like in a classroom. Example number 2 occurred at Oak Park Elementary School in South Carolina. It was performed by educator and PhD student Brandolyn Green. This was an urban school with 58% of K through 5 grade students qualifying for free lunch. 62% of the students claimed African American heritage, while 97% of the faculty identified as white. In many schools around the country, administrators try to identify at-risk students through what's called response to intervention, or RTI. In many situations, this affects students of color because schools see learning deficiencies as a problem, but in reality, if they're not being taught in a culturally responsive way, they might not actually have a problem. They're just not responding to the traditional European way of teaching. Ms. Green argued that schools rely too much on RTI, and it didn't address the cultural needs of the students. This particular study focused on African American male students in 3rd grade. At the beginning of the school year, only 18% of white males entered grade 3 below reading level, while 51% of black males entered grade 3 below reading level. Ms. Green selected 10 black male 3rd grade students from 2 different 3rd grade classes. Class 1 was 69% black, Class 2 was 70% black. Before the study, Ms. Green observed a lack of engagement and overall aversion for education for many black students at Oak Park. For the study, she implemented CRT strategies within a response to intervention framework for instruction. 4 students were taught with those CRT strategies, and the other 6 were in a comparison group using existing strategies. The study lasted 6 weeks. As Ms. Green began, she focused on building relationships with the students, their families, and their communities. She was able to break through to the boys and open the door for a willingness to learn, addressing the emotional stage of learning, which is receiving. Ms. Green tried to foster the classroom environment that addressed the effective needs of the students by removing intimidating factors within the classroom. She also provided choice in texts and topics for writing and provided leadership roles in and out of the classroom. Ms. Green allowed her students to move freely around the classroom and not just sit at their desks as long as they were working. She allowed the students to work in groups. Thanks to help from the school and grant money, many different texts were available for the students to read. Things like sports magazines, car magazines, biographies of successful African Americans, and books where blacks were the protagonists. One student's love for cars allowed him to take a leadership role with others who like cars. Students were supportive of each other. Bonds and friendships were formed from one-on-one conversations between Ms. Green, the students, and their families. Each student took a pre-assessment engagement test and post-assessment test after the 6 weeks. Participant 1 went from a 15 to 38, participant 2, 24 to 36, participant 3, 23 to 40, and participant 4, 11 to 40. There was a survey conducted among the 4 students and parents that said the teacher cared about their education and the effort made for them was greatly appreciated. One father said, quote, "I talked to my son and said, you better be good because you're taking care of him." The comparison group revealed very little increase between the pre and post assessment. 3 of the participants actually decreased their engagement levels in reading from the pre and post assessment. Ms. Green concluded that addressing needs of students is imperative in each classroom. It's a beginning step showing that culturally responsive teaching increases engagement levels and academic achievement. She also stated that there is a need for professional development in this area so more teachers can implement the practices of CRT. A final example of how culturally responsive teaching produces positive results and engagement among students occurred at the Ida B. Wells Academy in Georgia. IBWA, as it's called, is a private K-8 school made up of 100 African American students and 12 teachers. The school is situated in a surrounding low-income urban area in Atlanta. The makeup of the parents are mostly working class, with some having college or professional degrees. The study was conducted by Greg Wiggin, an education professor at UNC Charlotte, and Marsha Watson, an elementary education professor at Towson University. According to the National Assessment of Education Progress, or NAEP, only 36% of 4th graders and 34% of 8th graders are at or proficient in reading in public schools. In math, only 40% of 4th graders and 33% of 8th graders are at that same level of proficiency. Private schools aren't much better. In reading, the numbers are 49% for fourth graders, 56% for eighth graders. In math, it's 48% for fourth graders, 47% for eighth graders. Specifically in urban areas, the numbers are even more alarming. Only 32% of fourth graders in urban schools are proficient in reading. 36% are proficient in math. At the eighth grade level, it's 36% in reading, 30% in math. In data collected in 2014, IBWA scored 15% higher in both reading and math than the neighboring public schools. And nationally, they scored 20% higher than other private schools and 30% higher than most urban public schools. The reason for this success has been attributed to culturally responsive teaching. IBWA embraces a multicultural curriculum and anti-biased education. For example, IBWA substitutes class materials with CRT readings. Teachers expose their students to critical literature such as Alex Haley's The Autobiography of Malcolm X and Ivan Van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus. These books are banned or are unavailable in most public schools. IBWA uses the theme, "It takes a village." The village in this case signifies the communal efforts of parents, students, teachers, and the community. Many students and teachers suggest that the collective effort of the village leads to high academic achievement in African American schools, specifically at IBWA. One example of this village approach is the school's involvement in the community. During observations by the two professors for the study, a local artist from the community came in to give a lesson about Jacob Lawrence, a famous African American painter. This was a student's account of the experience. Quote, "Here at IBWA, they take time out of their day and our day to bring in other people who can teach us life lessons and other things that will help you in the future. And sometimes they'll bring people from different places, like one of them does like programming and stuff, and every once in a while they'll come in and they'll like talk about it, like the robotics. That's cool because they're right here in the community." Another student was interviewed about her experience and had this to say, "An African-centered education such as IBWA has had a huge positive effect on my education. This school has expanded my view of myself tremendously. Also, they teach so much about your background. This school informs you about your ancestors and history. The school goes into great detail about the people you have come from. In my opinion, this information has empowered me. This information about my ancestors really helps because I will always know who I am and where I come from." In conclusion, the achievement results for students and teachers are overwhelmingly positive when institutions install culturally responsive teaching as a teaching strategy. Some of you might be asking, why are these sample sizes so small? The reason is CRT has only been implemented for the last 25 to 30 years. As we discussed, most school systems still teach the one-size-fits-all strategy. So right now, CRT is being implemented in a more grassroots way. The big government bureaucracies haven't caught on yet to its effectiveness. In other words, the federal and state governments need more data like these examples to be willing to pump money into the system to fund professional development of teachers. As we've seen, you can't just ask a teacher who has no knowledge of CRT to start teaching in a culturally responsive way. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, 82% of public school teachers are white, while only 51% of the student population is white. By 2060, 64% of the nation's children will be people of color. One last food for thought I'll leave you with comes from Zaretta Hammond, who said culturally responsive teaching doesn't have to be race specific. While most examples involve people of color, culturally responsive teaching can be taught to all students, no matter their race or creed, because CRT allows us to see every student because we are all different and unique. Well, here's a look at my sources in case you'd like to take a further look into this topic, and I thank you so very much for watching my video.